As we move towards bringing children back to school, we must ask who was worst affected by the pandemic and why. Decoding Exclusion, an interview series by the Vidhi Centre for Legal Policy, aims to discuss the various facets of the problem of exclusion in education in India. With a range of experts in the field of law, policy, and education, we examine evidence on new sites of exclusion and ways in which we can support children and their households as we bring them back to school. Welcome to Vidhi's Decoding Exclusion, an interview series where we break down the various facets of exclusion from mainstream education in India. I'm Nisha, and today's episode is led by my colleague Pooja Pandey, who works as a senior resident fellow in the Inclusive Education vertical at the Vidhi Centre for Legal Policy. In today's episode, we're in conversation with Ankit Vyas, who has been working actively in the area of education as an independent researcher. Ankit formerly worked with Oxfam India in the capacity of a program coordinator for the Inequality and Education team and has authored some important studies on school education both during and prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. We all know that COVID-19 gave a huge push to the penetration of EdTech in India, and with it arose several equity concerns. In this discussion, Pooja and Ankit delve deeper into the question of the role of the state in regulation of EdTech, with the view of protecting the rights of the child. Ankit highlights how even though the over-reliance on EdTech seems to be subsiding post the pandemic, the focus on technology for education means that there's an urgent need to ensure that digital education is made accessible and equitable for all. He provides some important direction on how regulatory policy can play a role in ensuring just that. With that, let's jump into the episode.
Hello everyone. I am Pooja Pandey and I work as a Senior Resident Fellow with the Education team at Vidhi Centre for Legal Policy. I take this opportunity to welcome all of you to this interview series that we call Decoding Exclusion. In today's conversation, we'll be talking to Ankit Vyas, who has been working very actively in the areas of education as an independent researcher. Prior to this, Ankit was also working with Oxfam India in the capacity of a program coordinator for the Inequality and Education team. He has authored some very important studies on school education, and hopefully in today's conversation, we'll get to know and hear more from Ankit. A very, very warm welcome to this conversation, Ankit, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you, Pooja, for having me here at this talk. Look forward to speaking about some of the stuff and also about exclusion of children due to digital education.
Great. Thanks, Ankit. To the rest of our viewers, before we dive into this very interesting and engaging conversation, I'd like to give you a little bit of a context about what this interview series is and why are we doing this in the first place. So the Decoding Exclusion series is emerging out of a recently released report in which we have documented the status of out-of-school children, or also known as OOSC, during COVID-19. In the said report, we have synthesized evidence from a range of other research studies as well as from government sources to report and discuss a little bit more about what exactly happened with out-of-school children during COVID-19. Now, in order to deepen whatever we have found in the research and also to continue the discourse on out-of-school children, we have come up with this interview series where we are going to conduct in-depth conversation with a selected group of researchers as well as practitioners who have actively worked on education during COVID and even before that, and who understand what exclusion in education might look like.
Sure.
Hopefully, this interview will, of course, help us in giving some in-person, institutional, and on-ground insights of exclusion in education, and also act as an important mechanism for advocating for the inclusion of not just out-of-school children, but also other vulnerable categories of children. In today's segment with Ankit, we'll be focusing a little more on the impacts of education technology, digital education on overall equity and regulation in education. And without any further ado, I'd like to start the conversation and propose the first question to Ankit, if you're ready to go, Ankit.
Sure.
Okay. So Ankit, you've been very actively engaged in creating evidence around the impacts of education for some of the most marginalized groups in India, especially during COVID-19. Now, first and foremost, we'd like to know a little bit more about the kind of research and advocacy work that you've been doing during COVID-19. Over to you, Ankit.
Sure. Thanks for the question, Pooja. So a couple of things that I did as part of Oxfam India during COVID on education. The first was a status report that we developed to understand the impact of school closure and education of children. And this is something that we did in between June to July 2020. So it was the early days of the pandemic and the days of the lockdown, in a sense, where we sort of try to understand how many children are able to access education, what are the perspectives of teachers on education delivery when schools are closed, and so on. And based on this report, we drafted recommendations to the National Human Rights Commission on protecting rights of children during the pandemic. And this report even received a mention in the guidelines that were released by NHRC. We also did a follow-up report in October 2021 to sort of understand how children are experiencing reopening of schools after over 500 days of closure. So this report, in a sense, sort of capture, what are the challenges that teachers are also facing? Are students able to catch up? What has been the impact of school closure? And so on. And in addition to the research that we did, we also did a lot of advocacy with the government, where we wrote to the education department. We asked questions in parliament, essentially sort of trying to highlight this issue of the challenges of marginalized children when schools were closed and they lacked access to education. So in just sort of these are sort of a couple of things that we did around research and advocacy to highlight challenges of marginalized children during COVID.
Great, and I think it really sets the tone for the conversation. Just out of curiosity, before we get into this entire sea of digital education and the impacts,
Sure.
In the existing research and advocacy work which you've just described, what were some of the very startling findings with respect to possibly like discontinuity of education for children or even out of school children, if you can possibly share that, Ankit?
Sure. So I think two things that stood out very clearly, and I think not just in the Oxfam report, but I think in a lot of the other reports that followed, is the first one was clearly the issue of access. So our first study found that 80% children were unable to access digital education in any form. And these were children in government schools and in rural areas. The second was the issue of delivery itself. So one is, of course, the issue of access for children, the access of devices, or the issue of access of the internet and so on. But the other issue, because we'd also interviewed teachers, and their perspective was that they were also struggling to deliver education digitally. So even assuming that a child in rural setup has access to a mobile phone and has access to an internet, are teachers able to deliver education sort of effectively? And I think in our survey, about more than 80% teachers said that they were not confident with the medium, they were not trained, they were not oriented on how to actually deliver education using digital modes. And a lot of teachers also had similar issues of not having the right device, not having enough data packs, not having access to internet in certain areas. So these were two things that stood out very clearly. One, of course, being issue of access, and the other being the issue of delivery. And what our second survey found was, which sort of looked at the impact of school closure, found that where teachers as well as children, both of them reported that after schools reopened, after 500 days of closure, is that the children were struggling to catch up with what was being taught in class. So 2 in 3 children reported that they were struggling to sort of understand or follow what was being taught in their class, and which is a clear indication of the impact of the lack of access.
Great. So very nicely, like when you started, because I think these two studies give us two junctures of analysis, one at the onset of COVID, and second, like after COVID was getting over, schools are reopening, children are going back, of course. And we'll definitely keep coming back to these couple of important points that you mentioned, Ankit, especially with respect to access as well as delivery. So I think we'll be revisiting that again and again. Now, in the next segment, I think let's possibly take a step back. And I think this is more of a reflective question for somebody like you who's been working actively, and I'm sure who's also been following what other people are doing and saying when it comes to digital education. We know for sure that digital education and the over-reliance on digital education was a sudden event. Like at the onset of COVID, there was no option but to continue education through digital education. Now, if we evaluate this entire discourse of what was happening in the past 2 years reflectively, what, in your opinion, were some of the key research insights around digital education, not just from your studies, but also from other analysis and studies that were being conducted by different individuals and organizations?
So I think in addition to what I've already said about access and delivery, there was also the issue of pedagogy. So while a lot of the studies tended to focus on the idea of, children are not being able to access technology or teachers are struggling to deliver it, I think one interesting study that Azim Premji had done, where 90% teachers said that meaningful assessment of children's learning was not possible, when they were teaching through digital modes. And I think this is one area which probably didn't receive as much attention, but I think this was a very important insight that sort of challenged the whole narrative, which was still that point focused only on lack of access, to say, even if there is access, is this a meaningful way to deliver education? And for me, this was one finding that really stood out, was even if one assumes that, everyone has been given access, is it the right medium to deliver something effectively? And there are, of course, also issues of the content in terms of how representative is the content that you're using, right? Like there were states where digital education in many ways was standardized, right? So there was like a studio in the capital that was running these programs that were going to children across the state. Now, if you're a tribal child, sitting in a rural hamlet, and there is some teacher in the capital who is delivering content, does it cater to your, the group that you come from? Is that represented? Is your language represented in the content? I think these were some issues that also came up slightly, but I think which need to be explored a lot more in terms of the content of digital education itself.
Absolutely. And I think there has been very limited conversations on the content, like as far as my understanding and my research goes, which again naturally brings us to my next follow-up question. So of course, these were some of the areas where especially access and delivery was one of the things where people, especially access, was something people were talking about again and again on how people don't have, there's not enough penetration of digital medium. How are you going to prioritize this and stuff? But in your opinion and your experience, including your advocacy work, do you also think there were some of the research areas or even areas of concerns which were completely off the radar when it comes to digital education and even education technology during COVID?
So I think, like I was saying, the issue of pedagogy is what was missing quite a bit. I think when people were busy talking about access, I think this is one area that sort of got missed out and was also not as regulated. So in cases where education was still being delivered, I think there were there's very little research or review done of the type of content that was actually being disseminated to children. Because at that time, I think everyone was just busy with this idea of we just need to get the content out there, just make sure that children are learning in some form or the other. And I think this is an area that really got missed out, and very little research got done on the type of content that was delivered. And also, I think the effectiveness of that content is something that was not really measured much. The APU study did look at teachers saying that it's difficult to understand whether a child is learning or not. So the issue of assessment is something that came out, but again, we didn't really go back to children and ask them, is this content working for you? What is the duration of digital content that works best for you. We didn't have conversations on timelines. I mean, we had 5-year-old kids sitting through 6 hours of Zoom calls without breaks. I mean, uh, that's what we had in the name of digital education. So we had little research on attention spans, effective use of digital technology. How do we mix it up with sort of checks for understanding? I think that entire element of how the process of learning happens, I think, got missed out. And I think that's something that we need to sort of look at when sort of going into the future as more and more tech gets used. I think this is an area that we sort of need to look at and go beyond the issue of access.
Absolutely. And when you were pointing it, it like occurred to me that age wise, like content according to age, something else was being given to pre-primary, something else was given to higher education. There was absolutely no assessment on the type of content, especially like grade variations to that content. And possibly at the same time, even the providers. I mean, for central government, we still had some context of what was being taught, but for other state boards and even what like a lot of private providers must be providing as a part of their entire approach, nobody knows. Like it's an absolute black hole there. Okay, getting a little bit into the in-depth of this entire conversation on like education technology and digital education, in your opinion, Ankit, what are some of the key impacts of this use of EdTech on marginalized children, including maybe possibly some anticipatory long-term effects, which were of course happening? And when I say effect, I mean both positive and negative effects, in your opinion, on EdTech during the pandemic and possibly even now, what we can anticipate or what have we seen?
Sure. So, I mean, one has been, when we talk about the pandemic, I think in the context of the pandemic, EdTech was something that, in a sense, replaced physical classes. So it was not seen as something that was supplementary. It was sort of the only thing that was there in terms of providing education. And of course, with the USR reports and with Oxfam's own report, I think what we've seen is that learning has obviously gone down. I mean, the recent USR report shows that the percentage of children being able to read a grade 2 text has actually gone down to a figure that was last recorded in 2012. So we've, in that sense, gone back 10 years because of the reliance only on tech. That being said, the pandemic was a scenario where tech was used standalone. One can, of course, also use tech sort of as a supplement to physical classes. And I think that's the thing that we need to sort of understand is if tech is used as a supplement to physical classes, there is sort of still a sense of it being helpful in some ways if it's used in a structured manner, if there is a pedagogical use to it. But I think what is important to understand is that tech should not be seen as a replacement to physical classes. During COVID, in some sense, we didn't have a choice. We were not prepared. And in many ways, that is why it happened. But I think an important thing to understand is that we should not be looking at sort of EdTech as a way to replace physical classes. And an interesting finding that USR also shows is that private tuitions increased during the pandemic. And that is clearly because parents also recognize the need to have physical classes, to have like a actual person teaching and guiding their children instead of just this one-way interaction that tech was offering. So I think one of the long-term implications of this is if EdTech becomes something that gradually, replaces more and more physical interaction, it will become a way for the richer people to buy physical classes in the form of private tuitions, in the form of small group tuitions. So it will increasingly become a situation where people who can buy their way into education will get access, and those who are unable to sort of make that investment won't. So I think that is a scarier long-term impact if there is an over-reliance on technology. It also reduces the autonomy of the teacher, and it risks sort of leaving parents having to spend more money to get physical classes rather than it happening within a classroom setup.
Yeah, absolutely. And this entire thing of like rich benefiting from it because they will have access to it. But even within the poor, I think there are certain categories of children who will inevitably be left out or are
Of course.
even now completely missing out of this conversation. So,
Yeah.
Ankit, did you find this kind of a gradation between the poor itself when it comes to tech, like education technology, and not just in
Right.
terms of being able to afford it, but other by design, by default, inaccessibility of tech, which were maybe experienced by different categories of vulnerable children differently? If you have any
Sure.
insights on that.
Sure. So of course, I mean, the issue is intersectionality, I think, is an important lens to look at when one is, looking at exclusion. There is, of course, the urban-rural divide in terms of access to technology, access to internet itself, where, of course, children in more remote areas simply didn't have network to access it, and there were cases of them having to climb hills and get on top of trees and stuff like that. But there is, of course, there is exclusion and discrimination even within the household. So there is clear gender imbalance of if there are three children and there's one phone and there are two boys and one girl, there's clear data that, the boys sort of get the mobile and get to use that data, and girls are excluded much more. So there is, of course, a gender element to it. There is a caste element to it clearly. So uh, Dalits, Adivasis, Muslims obviously have been more marginalized, they have less access. And if you break that down into saying a Dalit girl in rural Jharkhand versus an urban upper caste boy in Delhi, there's obviously a massive uh, gap there as well. So there is that lens also that one needs to look at when talking about exclusion, because it's not as simple as saying the rich and the poor. It's uh, obviously the person like a Dalit girl in a rural area will have the least possibility of accessing the device. So even within the household, there is limited bargaining power to do that.
Absolutely. And if I may add my 2 cents to it, because
Sure.
we've also been engaging with this issue, we found that, especially for children with disability, this entire
Hmm.
ambit of
Of course.
tech
Yeah.
accessibility has been an issue for a very, very long
Absolutely.
time. And during COVID, it just like
Absolutely.
it took a very ugly shape and very
Yeah.
ugly form when it came to children with disability. And I was also very interestingly having a conversation for somebody who works with children in need of care and protection, or children in like shelter homes or even
Right. Right.
juvenile justice systems. Tech hasn't even reached to them, like,
Yeah.
and there is
Yeah.
absolutely no conversation on
Right.
who's
Right.
exactly providing these services to them. Okay.
Absolutely.
So when we talk about this entire tech and who's benefiting from it, who's being given access to tech or not,
Yeah.
a very important and obvious conversation also comes around the providers
Hmm.
of these ed tech. Of course, we know government to some extent has been providing different platforms, different avenues for ensuring access to technology, but a very dominant part of it
Hmm.
has also cropped up in the form of private ed tech
Right.
providers or private, digital education
Yeah.
service providers
Right.
across India. Now, how do you envision this entire differences in approaches or orientation to education technology when it comes to state providers versus the private providers? And what do you think are some of the very crucial challenges when it comes to edtech provision by these like government and their private counterparts?
Sure. So I think the first uh, point is, of course, in terms of the objectives. I mean, for the government, there isn't a the objective is to use it to get sort of use the tech to access as many children as for it to reach as many children as possible. So there is no uh, profit motive as such that the government has when it's using technology. Uh, but with the new age ed tech providers, clearly the main objective is not education, learning, or access. It's about maximizing profits. Uh, and that's the fundamental, I think, difference between these two providers, and in many ways, the risk of the rise of the new edtech providers. And I think we've been increasingly seeing a lot of these stories, right, of unethical business practices that are focused on maximizing profits. There have been multiple stories of poor parents falling into debt uh, based on some to buy some of these products. A lot of these products are being uh, sort of sold using EMIs, and there are now a lot of parents who are sort of stuck with that EMI based on false promises that have been made by these providers. And at this stage, again, I go back to the point of there being very little analysis of what is the core product that these organizations, these private edtech providers are selling. There is very little analysis of what is the quality of the content. Is the content representative of different groups in India? What is the quality of the pedagogy? I think these are conversations we just haven't been able to get into, also because of the blatant profiteering that these companies have indulged in. There was a Oxfam policy brief on this in around May of last year, which sort of compared the average price of an edtech product in the Indian market to the income of the lowest wealth quintile in India. And it found that the average price is almost 80% of the per capita income of the lowest wealth quintile in India. So it's clearly not a product that everyone can afford, but increasingly it's a product that's been marketed to everyone. And it's being marketed in ways that are unethical, unregulated, which have sort of focused on maximizing profits. And at the same time, I think we've completely lack an understanding of how effective these products are in the first place. How effective is their content?
Absolutely. And it's very troubling. Like it's a matter of trouble that it's becoming closer and closer to home, actually, because we were reading about this in the news for some time. Now I can count on my finger and tell a couple of people who have fallen into this trap, or like it's coming closer to home. That's one thing. The other very important bit, which is completely not being discussed, is around privacy concerns. Like when you talk about tech, it also has a lot of element of privacy, of child rights privacy, and even parents' privacy. And the other problem, which I think speculatively is happening, that now that we have resumed like physical schools again, we all of a sudden this conversation on edtech, especially private edtech, has taken a backseat. They have continued to, like, their models are continuing, they are selling these things, but there is absolutely no discourse on conversation on what exactly is happening at the moment, which automatically brings us to this entire need. Do you think there is a need to regulate this space in the first place? And when I say regulate, I don't just mean it for private players, but I also mean it for edtech in general, including government players. What are your opinions on that, Ankit?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there is a strong need to regulate and I think understand the space better. I think the first step to sort of look at edtech would be to sort of look at it the same way as you've looked at physical education, right? Like the same way that you've looked at content that has been delivered in physical form. So if you look at textbooks, for example, there has always been a process to review how the textbooks are created, to review the content in the textbook, so there is a process where there is a committee that reviews the content. It goes through multiple rounds. So there is a process that has always been in place for physical content. So I think there is for some reason, we sort of looked at edtech as being something very different. I think the first thing we need to look at is sort of remove the separation when it comes to the content and say that the same standards that we have held for physical content in the form of textbooks, in the form of physical learning materials, we need to apply these standards to edtech content as well. So essentially have like a review committee to look at the quality of the content, involve teachers, involve experts to look at the content and actually give feedback on whether this is fit to go to children in the first place or not. So have a process of doing that before this content is actually rolled out and it disseminated widely. The second thing we need is a strong grievance redressal mechanism in place. And this is something that we kind of sorely missed during the pandemic, where there were parents and children sort of complaining about falling into these debt traps by these companies, but there wasn't really a clear mechanism to address these complaints of parents. So I think we definitely need that mechanism in place sort of quickly, where parents can sort of complain, and we have someone sort of who can look at redressing these. On a long-term basis, I think we really need a holistic EdTech policy, and I think it's important to sort of have a separate policy for EdTech, because I think the challenges of regulating these providers are new, and they're also complex in nature. Their scope is also quite massive, ranging from regulating the content to regulating their prices to their business practices. So I think we need a more holistic policy that sort of looks at the overall ambit of EdTech, and that really seeks feedback from parents, teachers, educators, government bodies to develop this policy, so that it looks at all of these elements and is comprehensive in doing that.
Thank you for this, Ankit. And I think you've raised a very important point, that education, technology, or digital education is not something which is separate from education. It's an extension of education.
Yeah.
Because even in the grievance redressal bit, a lot of the times it takes a consumer angle where it's looked at as a good, as a service. And as long as we look at education technology as a service, which is driven by profit motives or other things, we'll never be able to look at it from a rights-based perspective, which education ideally should be looked at. And you're absolutely right about this entire policy being a little dynamic, because the scope is so new. It's the first time that we're coming up with something like this. So very interesting insights there. Now that we're talking about regulation, I'd like to also come to state's response when it comes to digital education. Of course, policy and all of these grievance redressal is one bit, and you've started it off very nicely by flagging those two issues. But how do you think the state should prioritize in addressing the problems of marginalized children, dropout children, out of school children, specifically when it comes to addressing the digital device, which has already been created or which can possibly be further further widened in the coming period? So,
I think when it comes to out of school children, I think the first thing we need is for the government and different states to actually accept that this is a problem that exists and go about doing a large scale mapping of out of school children. I think there have been multiple studies that have found that children have dropped out, children are not coming to school regularly. And I think what we really need is for states to do a large scale mapping of who these children are, what is the quantum of children who are not in school. And once they've identified that, really do a large scale on ground mobilization through local government bodies, through panchayat samitis, through volunteers on the ground to get these children back into school. And in doing that, it's also important to sort of make sure that their entry into school is unconditional as well. So not looking at, things like, do they have an Aadhaar card? Do they have if they're migrants, do they have some sort of domicile from their home state? Sort of bypassing all of those restrictions to unconditionally admit children into school. And when they are in school, having some sort of a structured remedial curriculum to actually facilitate their re-entry. What Oxfam study found was that, even when schools reopened 500 days after closure, they were just continuing the syllabus as if nothing had happened. So it was, if kids had, let's say, they were in grade 3 at the start of the pandemic and they joined back sort of near the end of grade 4, the teachers were directly teaching them grade 4 material without, doing the stuff that they'd missed in between. So when we're trying to get out of school children into school, I think it's also important to have some sort of a transitionary curriculum to help them sort of get back and to sort of recover the learning loss of the learning deprivation that they went through. So yeah, I think with regard to, I think, getting out of school children back into school, I think it's important to, in many ways, go back to the basics, which is essentially mapping children, making sure they're in school, making sure they're attending school regularly and supporting them in that process through a structured curriculum.
Absolutely. Again, and this is something, especially with respect to out of children, this has been an approach or like a suggestion long back. When you want to reintegrate them into school, you have to start from scratch. And these are the approaches that you have to take. Another follow-up question, which is not entirely related to this question, Ankit, but like you've been mentioning about teachers again and again in this entire conversation. So how do you think teachers can, one, be a part of this entire reintegration process? And a separate question on this, let's assume that digital education is here to stay. It's here to be continued. How do we empower or capacitate teachers so that like they will be able to take it forward eventually, pandemic or otherwise, in using or deploying these digital mediums in education?
So I think the first is to, a lot of the initiatives that we saw during the pandemic that did well in keeping children sort of connected to learning were in many ways initiatives that teachers took of their own accord. So they were very teacher-led initiatives, like the story of the teacher in Jharkhand where he used the huts of the community as blackboards, and then children were sort of studying there. Or the stories of many teachers who used mohalla classes where children were taught in small groups, which kept them connected. So at the core of a lot of these initiatives is essentially teachers' autonomy. So teachers getting the autonomy to do what they want and then using that autonomy to keep children connected to learning. And I think this is something that this is a principle that should also be at the core of anything to do with EdTech. So when we talk about teaching and EdTech, I think essentially the teacher's autonomy should be at the core of how we use EdTech. It should not be something that gets pushed from the top, or it gets pushed by either a government or the providers. I think eventually we need to understand the teachers are experts in their own classrooms. They understand the context of their classroom best. We certainly can build capacity of teachers on how to use EdTech. We can tell them about the different ways, sort of in a sense give them an offering of these are 3 or 4 ways in which you can use it. But at the end of the day, I think it has to be the teacher's choice in how to best use EdTech in their classroom, because each classroom is different, each classroom's context is different, and how you use technology will depend a lot on that context. So I think at the end of the day, I think that's the most important principle that I would stress is let the teachers decide. Sure, build capacity, build infrastructure, do all of those things, have the infrastructure in place. Of course, don't rely on the teacher to have to buy a laptop and have to set up a projector and spend their own money and buy data packs, which has also happened. So first set up that infrastructure, build their capacity, but at the end of the day let them decide on how they best feel technology should be used in their classroom.
I 100% agree with you, Ankit, on this, and especially your entire insight on teacher autonomy and giving them the choice rather than imposing something on them. And during COVID, at least from whatever we have been, like, we did one of the studies in Maharashtra with pre-primary educators where the children were very young to use those technologies themselves. Like they were very, very young to have used a computer or a phone independently. It was entirely teacher driven, like 100% teacher driven, with a lot of support from the parents and the school's mechanism. So if you give them the autonomy, but at the same time provide them support through school infrastructure and even parental support, that I think makes a lot of difference. And again, this has, I think, also been an area of gap. We haven't emphasized enough on how much teachers have performed during the COVID and what are they generally capable of. Okay, so I will come to like sort of the last question of this entire segment, Ankit, and this is our favorite question. So we ask this to everybody that we interview. So as a researcher, as well as a practitioner who's passionate about education, working on education, where do you think we have dropped the ball when it comes to research advocacy during COVID-19? And in your opinion, what are some of the things we should definitely prioritize going forward when it comes to inclusion of children in education?
Sure. Yeah, I think this is a good question with many answers. potentially, because I think there's a lot that we as researchers and practitioners sort of dropped the ball on. But I think couple of things that I can highlight is, one is, I think uh, we were so focused on the tech aspect of things, of exclusion of children due to tech, that we were unable to highlight the non-tech based initiatives as much as we would have liked. So a lot of the uh, non-tech stuff that was happening in terms of either the mohalla classes or the small scale initiatives that teachers were doing, I think that is something that we should have highlighted better to sort of communicate the idea that even this is possible, to counter the narrative of uh, only tech is the answer. So I think that is one area where we could have done more research and work on, because there was amazing work happening uh, at the ground level that individual teachers were doing, and I think these stories deserve to be captured and told more. The other thing I think is we should also have captured stories of individual children more. I think a lot of the data uh, focused on children as in terms of numbers rather than as individuals. A lot of the research basically read 80% children are able to access tech, 70% children are not in school. So it became like this uh, homogenized mass rather than individual children. And I think that is something that we needed, especially to highlight uh, the lens of intersectionality, to highlight how different children of different groups were struggling and how they were being excluded. So I think that is something that we should have done better, and that's something that we should aim to do better going forward. So while we continue to have specific data, we should also capture stories of uh, individual children. And I think the last thing is it's important to, I guess, go back to the basics of how uh, sort of India has managed to get children into school in the first place. So focusing on mobilization of volunteers, focusing on small scale, village level, local uh, level activities to keep children in school, uh, to keep children interested, to keep doing activities, to do like after school camps or programs in the community. Just do a lot of mobilization on the ground and give autonomy to teachers, to uh, the local governance, to the panchayats, to lead some of those, rather than having a top-down approach where a lot of this is based on state guidelines. Just giving much more autonomy to people on the ground.
Wow, that's some really interesting insights and some very important questions, and especially this entire idea of highlighting more and more good practices, not just tech but even non-tech. And
Yeah.
you're absolutely right, because they haven't been featured enough, like in this entire conversation. And also your point about a decentralized approach, because in case of how to school children, historically this the approach of like community driving that initiative or volunteers driving that
Absolutely.
initiative has done wonders. And just to sort of end with this, the research approach, entire research approach, because I think during COVID, it became about rapid assessments and making sense of the
Right.
issue
Right.
rather than highlighting good case studies or individual stories. So I think now is also a good time for us as practitioners slash researchers to reflect a little bit more on what exactly was happening and how can we go forward from here. Okay, any final insights from you, Ankit? Because like I hope I got you passionate and startled on this conversation. Any final insights that you might have for our viewers or the audience that we have here?
So it's good that we are sort of having a conversation on these issues, especially on the issue of EdTech, on the regulation of EdTech. And I think we need to continue having these conversations. And like I said, I think we need to understand a little bit more, sort of get into a bit more nuance and the specifics of this. So I think so far a lot of the discussion has been around access to technology, or has been around exclusion of children. I think now that, like you said, technology is here to stay, I think we need to dig a little bit deeper into who is tech for, what is the content like, is the content effective, Is it representative? So I think get into these more nuanced questions of what tech is. So essentially opening that black box of, EdTech being this one big homogenized thing, sort of breaking that down into saying, what are the different elements of EdTech? What are the different products? What do these products deliver? What is the quality of the content? And also, I think getting children into the conversation and asking them, what do you like about this? What do you not like about this? Is this effective for you? What would you like more of? So I think getting that is also important. A lot of these conversations have been driven by sort of so-called experts or educators, but I think it's important to also get children's perspectives on this.
Perfect. So we need to pass the baton to the actual beneficiaries of these
Yeah.
services, which is the children, and even to some extent, even the teachers, as you were mentioning before as well. Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Ankit. Of course, this is an unending conversation, especially when it comes to EdTech and digital technology. We also know that NEP has put a lot of push on this entire digital education ambit, and we'll have to definitely wait and watch to see what this actually pans out to. For the viewers who are listening / watching us, if you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to let us know either in the comments section or reach directly to us. We'll be happy to answer those questions. If you have any specific questions for Ankit, we'll be happy to direct those questions to Ankit on behalf of you. If you also have suggestions for any other ideas on EdTech, on digital education, feel free to reach out to us. And with this, I'd like to thank Ankit once again for this very insightful conversation and giving us the time. I'm sure this is first of many other conversations that we are going to have with you. Okay, thanks a lot for being with us today.
Thank you, Pooja.
This podcast is produced by the Vidhi Centre for Legal Policy under the Kotak-Karma Vidhi Inclusive Education Program. The Kotak-Karma Vidhi Inclusive Education Program is a CSR initiative by Kotak Mahindra Bank Ltd. This podcast is based and born from Vidhi's report, Clearing the Air, a synthesized mapping of out-of-school children during COVID-19 in India. This report is produced under funding received from Voltas Limited as part of their CSR initiative. Video design and editing by Asad Ali, illustration by Hitesh Sonar.